Good evening and welcome everyone to our special online event, Justice for Theia, calling for prosecution and national reforms for wolves. I'm Joseph Grove, Senior Director of Communications for Animal Wellness Action, and your moderator for this evening's conversation. In a moment, I'll briefly introduce our guests, but please accept a few notes before we get underway. First, thank you for registering. No issue in my history in communications has caught the attention of advocates, and dare I say, mustered the wrath of them like this one. On behalf of all of us tonight, please accept our gratitude for your passion and your willingness to make a difference. We intend for you to sign off tonight with concrete steps you can take on behalf of Theia and all wolves. Second, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. We've allotted time at the end of the event to address them. Simply enter them into Zoom at any time over the course of the hour, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You should be able to see a questions or chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, depending on your version of Zoom, and I'll keep an eye on them as we go along. Third, we want to thank our generous sponsor for funding the Claudia Miller Ignite Series on animal welfare. Her patronage enables us to bring you this and other events at no cost and to ensure as many people as possible have the opportunity to attend them. Finally, we'll send you a link tomorrow to the recorded version of this conversation. This is in case you missed part of it and want to rewatch it, or, as we hope you will, share it with friends. All of that said, please allow me to introduce our panelists. Wayne Pacelli is the president of Animal Wellness Action and its sister organization, the Center for a Humane Economy. He has fought for 3 decades on the state and federal levels to protect U.S. wolves and work to protect wolves from exploitation in the upper Great Lakes region. Also with us is Dr. Susan Kane Ronning, a licensed psychologist in Bellingham, Washington, who specializes in child behavior disorders. She has conducted hundreds of evaluations on children, documenting the link between animal cruelty and subsequent acts of human violence. She will speak about how these such acts of cruelty to animals are unmistakable indicators of a menacing presence in our human communities. An ardent environmentalist, Dr. Kane Ronning collaborates with conservation groups to reform the Washington Fish and Wildlife Department and is working to address the cruel, inhumane wolf policies and legislation in Wyoming. A quick but important note, she is not here, and we are not here, to comment specifically on Cody Roberts, the man who ran over, tortured, mocked, and killed the Wyoming wolf. Rather, she will address the psychologies generally of people who abuse animals. Rounding out our panel is Rolf Peterson. He is a research professor at Michigan Technological University and is nationally recognized as the Dean of American Wolf Biologists, having played a central role in the Wolf Moops project at Isle Royal National Park in northern Michigan, and he's done so since 1970. He has also conducted wolf prey research in Alaska, Minnesota, and Wyoming. Now, all that said, I turn it over to our first speaker, Wayne Pacelli.
Joseph, thank you, and thanks to each of you for joining us today for this webinar about the killing of a young adolescent female wolf in Wyoming just a couple of months ago. And once that came to light, the incredible reaction to it and the continuing work to pursue the prosecution of the perpetrator, but also to address the larger human-wolf relationship that really has turned in the wrong direction in Wyoming over many years, and we need to remedy the situation. I want to start just by mentioning some good news, because I know that this is a tough subject for people to think about. This young wolf victimized in such a terrible way, and I think it's important for all of us to have hope and to feel that our work is yielding benefits for animals who are at risk because of human behavior and actions. And just this evening, we got word that in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which is a beautiful unit of the National Park Service in western North Dakota, not too far from Wyoming, we got word that the wild horses of that 70,000 acre park, about 200 of them are going to be spared roundup and removal and all of the challenges that result from stressing those animals and taking them out and putting them in potentially much more dangerous circumstances. And this was a fight that North Dakotans led. And the U.S. Senator John Hoeven from North Dakota actually, negotiated with the National Park Service, and the Park Service agreed not to remove these 200 horses from the National Park Service unit. And the governor had spoken out and called for the protection of the wild horses, who are an incredible draw of tens and tens of thousands of people to North Dakota every year, and specifically to the gateway communities around this national park. And it was a reminder to me that, the United States was on a path to cause harm to these animals. And the local people, the people not just around the park, but the people throughout North Dakota, recognized that these animals were part of their heritage, part of their ecology, part of their economy. And they knew that so many people came to see these animals because they're beautiful and fascinating and extraordinary. And it reminded me at some level of one element of this debate about wolves. Are wolves pariahs? Are wolves a menace? That's the way some people frame this issue. But in truth, and I hope that we get an opportunity to explore this, and I'll do my best to explore this aspect of it with Rolf Peterson, wolves bring incredible economic benefits to Wyoming. Certainly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where so many people go to see wolves, to watch wolves, and experience the great joy of seeing them restored to part of their historic range. So they also have an incredible ecological role, and I'm going to ask Rolf to speak about that in a little bit as well. And I just want to mention my own fascination with wolves. Like many of you, my interest in animals started at a very young age, and I had an aunt who gave me a subscription to National Geographic magazine. Almost every issue had a feature story about a different type of animal, whether it was elephants or hippopotamuses or wolves or squid, whatever it may have been. And I was captivated by the images of animals and the incredible National Geographic photography, the compact stories about their lives and their communities. And I, would order National Geographic books. And I remember one called Vanishing Wildlife of North America. And it had Rolf's work in there when I was a teenager, maybe even a pre-adolescent. And Rolf had been studying wolves. He took over from a researcher named Durwood Allen and had been studying moose and wolves on Isle Royal National Park, which is an archipelago that's part of Michigan. There's the main peninsula of Michigan, then there's the upper peninsula, and then above the upper peninsula is Isle Royal National Park, which is a complete wilderness area. And Rolf was studying the relationships between moose and wolves, and I was just absolutely captivated by it. And when I went to college, I applied for an internship with the Student Conservation Association, spent a summer there, got to meet this great man, Rolf Peterson, and he and I have stayed in touch through the years. And we worked together to protect Michigan's wolves. There was a plan to have commercial trapping and trophy hunting of them. And I had worked to put measures on the ballot in Michigan with so many Michigan animal welfare and conservation advocates. And we won 2 ballot measures to affirm the notion that the people of Michigan, which is a very big hunting state and a very big agricultural state, wanted to see these animals protected and that they have more value alive than dead. So the wolf issue has always had a big place in my life from my pre-adolescent days, and during my work as an adult in animal protection, I worked very hard to protect wolves. And when I saw this case, when a friend of mine sent me a story that was based on leaked information about what Cody Roberts did to this wolf, I was so angry. And when I get angry about animals, I try not to let it cannibalize me and bring me down. I try to turn it into something positive. What can we do to address the situation? And that's what I've been working on since that email came into my inbox. And a lot has happened And I'm really glad to have Susan and Rolf on this call so we can have kind of a roundup discussion about what's happening. I think, again, everybody on this call knows what happened. A man in Sublette County, Wyoming, ran over a young wolf with a snowmobile, injured her grievously, took her into his possession, bound her mouth, and then, at some level, tormented her at home, and then paraded her in front of family and other patrons at a bar before he killed her. It's not clear, if there have been a lot of reports about other things that he may have done to her, uncorroborated at this time. But what we know that he did was awful, inexcusable, unacceptable, can't be tolerated in our society. And I guess, Susan, I want to ask you, given your professional background, I mean, what was your first reaction when you learned of what this man did to this young female wolf?
It's a good question. I, like most other people, was shocked, and my body froze. My heart, started racing. My throat tightened, all those kind of stress trauma responses that we experience. And I started to have the same things that I think other people have. I started to have intrusive thoughts that became part of my day for several days. It interrupted my sleep. The first 2 nights, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up and picturing these pictures and images, not just the images that we saw, but the images that we pictured. And that's the piece of empathy and compassion. Those of us who have those qualities, we play out what we think happened to her, and that freezes our bodies. And so that then creates a very sympathetic, dominant response in our body, where we replay it, we relive it, we hurt for her, we grieve, and we feel powerless and helpless.
That really resonates with me because, I've been doing this for a long time. I started an animal advocacy group when I was 19 years old as a sophomore in college, right before I went to Isle Royal. And I get as upset now as I did when I was 19. And I've seen everything. I mean, I've been to slaughterhouses, I've been to the ice floes of Canada, I've been to animal fights, I've been to live pigeon shoots. I've seen it all, but I'm still angry and upset. But I try to channel myself into some constructive action rather than just have it focused internally. And I'm hoping that our viewers, listeners, maybe try to do that as well with some of their energy. Let's focus this on something constructive, but easier said than done.
Well, you bring up an important point that if we become what's called sympathetic dominant, that means we go out of our frontal lobe and into the emotional part of our brain, and we secrete more cortisol, more norepinephrine. So our body, it becomes activated. The important part of that is we have 3 choices. We freeze, we flight, which means we either shut down or we disappear from the issue, or we fight. The fight in this issue is the empowerment piece. We organize, we unite, we act together, we boycott, we fight with the law, we do all the things that we can do because that's energizing. And sometimes I think we forget that we can't change what happened to Theia. We can change whether or not it happens again. And that's the empowerment piece. And we have to stay in that place and we have to unite. Yeah.
Well, I think that so many people have reacted in a powerful way. And I've been through a number of really, worldwide sort of outrage moments. Michael Vick, when his dogfighting ring was discovered, and when Walter Palmer shot that African lion in Wyoming National Park, luring this incredible male lion out of Wyoming and shooting him and wounding him, and then going back the next morning. And I think of an incident that didn't really have an individual person involved. We did, with a former organization, did an undercover investigation of downer cows at this slaughter plant in Southern California, and these cows were being dragged into the slaughterhouses. They were non-ambulatory, they couldn't walk, and they were pushed with bulldozers, and so many people were so angry about this. And I've seen a lot of people just say, I can't handle it. I don't want to be exposed to this. And for me, that's such a loss, because the people who care so much are the ones that we need. I mean, are there any little tips that you have for people to kind of stick with this and to cope? And I guess maybe we both said it in terms of the empowerment of doing something about it, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more.
I think this issue is a little different in the sense that when it hit the news in a really graphic way, and all of us could get our heads around, I guess, the innocence of a wolf out living in its environment with a wolf pack that was connected and bonded to this wolf. And we can relate to that. We can relate to what it feels like to be separated from one's family, and the innocence of an animal just being out in the wild, being a wolf, and the fact that somebody ruthlessly chose to run it down. And I think that piece is really important. And I want to talk about that because there's a lot of research about psychopathy, and what we know is what's called the dark triad. And the dark triad was researched in around 1960s. And it came up with 3 different issues of personality traits. The first one was Machiavellianism, and then narcissism and psychopathy. And those traits, the Machiavellianism, I'm going to hold on and I'll have that here for you really quick. But Machiavellianism is when is the sly, deceptive, distrusting, and manipulative aspect of a personality. Narcissism is grandiosity, entitlement, dominance, and superiority. And then psychopathy is high impulsivity, thrill-seeking, low empathy, and anxiety. And of all of those three traits, psychopathy is the robust indicator of antisocial behavior. And when the research looked at these negative attitudes towards animals that were associated to these 3 traits, and what they found is that while these 3 traits together created negative attitudes towards animals, the psychopathy was most related to the torture of wild animals. And that's the intentional hurting of animals that is the standard diagnosis criteria for psychopathy. And so it's important to kind of think about this in a mental health way of what kind of people do this. Of course, we're not going to diagnose any singular person. That's unethical, and we're not going to do that. But I think it's important for us to understand what kind of people are drawn to this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And what it does to their brains.
Right. And I guess also what it means as an indicator in general of future behavior. I have been, in this field, as I noted, for a long time. It's clear that this notion has become widely embraced outside of animal welfare circles, that animal cruelty and other forms of social violence and inappropriate social behavior are correlated. I mean, can you just give us a short little rundown of what the conventional professional thinking is about animal cruelty as an indicator of a larger pathology?
So what we need to think about first is that babies aren't born being cruel to animals. This is something that's created. There may be a little bit of a genetic predisposition to some antisocial behavior, perhaps, but we're not born that way. This is created, and it's multi-generational. It's multi-generational and systemic in communities where wildlife or animals aren't valued. They're utilitarian, or they don't have purpose. They're considered vermin. They're considered discardable. And so if we look at the correlates, seeing animal abuse, witnessing it, leads to further acts of animal abuse. Males and that are physically punished, and the reality is males are more often physically punished than females, and they're more likely to abuse animals. Among sexual murders, animal cruelty co-occurs with children who were sexually victimized. I think we can directly relate that to a feeling of powerless, helplessness, hopelessness, and then perpetuating that out on something lesser than them that they can then dominate. 43% of school shooters commit earlier acts of animal cruelty. 70% of the most serious violent offenders in prison have a history of repeated severe animal abuse. But if we look at childhood issues, there are some correlates and things that we say are comorbid, co-occur with each other. Abuse and neglect and poor attachment. In societies that sanction abuse, physical, mental, and sexual abuse or emotional abuse too, and neglect, not making sure that kids have food, safe shelters, safe situations, and then disrupted and poor attachments so that we're separating them from families and they're going through multiple attachments. Kids in foster homes can experience that. Witnessing bullying, experiencing or witnessing bullying or experiencing bullying or being bullied. Behavior disorders. Kids with oppositional defiant disorder who are defiant and they're oppositional and they don't like to follow rules, about 30% of those will become what's called conduct disordered. Of the conduct disordered individuals, they tend to violate, more social norms. They might run away, they might be truant, they might be cruel to animals, they fire set, they might aggress towards other kids or other people. And about 50% of those become antisocial personality disordered. And when we have antisocial personality disorder, then we're looking at people who break laws, they're impulsive, they're reckless, they lack remorse, they're controlling, and they're lying, perhaps. And of that, the most important piece of antisocial personality disorder, again, we talk about antisocial personality and sociopathy, and those are similar, just different names. But a more severe component of that is the psychopathy that I'm referring to. And with psychopathy, a really important piece of that is that callous, unemotional aspect with low empathy and little remorse. That piece is a real indicator of harm to animals, torture, and cruelty.
That's a really really great summary. A lot of this is personal, what the child experiences and what sort of parental influence. What about the larger social influence? I think of Wyoming, right? Wyoming adopted these policies to basically eliminate wolves. I mean, it really fostered an attitude of hatred toward wolves. And some of the ranchers, not all of the ranchers, some of the trophy hunters, who want to shoot their elk or deer and think that every animal killed by a moose is one fewer for him or her. I mean, it struck me that it was a climate of hate in Wyoming against wolves. And there are a lot of people, I've talked to a lot of them, who are deeply caring about wolves in Wyoming, but their voices have been suppressed or they haven't raised them loudly enough, and these voices of hate have dominated. To me, that created a Cody Roberts. I mean, obviously there's a lot more to him, and again, we're not getting into a diagnosis of him, but it didn't feel like he's just a complete one-off to me.
Absolutely not. Creating a culture that torments and tortures is, as I said, a systemic, multi-generational issue. I read a letter to the editor, I think it was in the Casper, Wyoming Tribune, and it was by somebody who knew Cody Roberts, grew up with him, may have been related, I can't remember, but he mentioned that his grandparents eradicated the wolves in that area. Now we've got that systemic, multi-generational view. And when I attended last week and spoke at the Wyoming Fish and Game Department meeting, and they capped the webinar at 500 people. And in order for me to get into that, I had to wait for somebody to leave. So I had to coordinate with somebody else who was leaving, and so I could slip in and take that person's spot because it was so full of people who were so motivated. That's the hopeful piece. But the people there talked about whacking, and they talked about it, whacking as as running over coyotes and wolves with snowmobiles or ATVs. And not only is it legislated in Wyoming, but other states like Idaho, but they talked about it as being a weekend pastime, that they would go out and whack coyotes as a family to do that. Again, that's a systemic issue. You talked about behavior like Cody Roberts, perhaps being him being indoctrinated into that. That's an example of how that happens. The other thing is that the norm for this, the Wyoming Speaker of the House, Albert Summers, said that he knows Roberts and he's a decent guy. So this minimizing of behavior, trying to rationalize and dismiss it. In psychology, those are called, they're defense mechanisms, but they're also called cognitive thinking errors, where we don't take responsibility for behavior, we rationalize it and we dismiss it. And that's what those people are doing about a behavior that we consider very heinous. But the other piece is that studies show that the liberalizing killing of wolves increases poaching and wolf disappearances. So when our federal government delisted and deregulated the Northern Rocky Mountain wolves, that listing, they were actually condoning, because they knew with this research that this would happen. Anytime you liberalize the killing of wolves, this happens.
I saw it happen in Wisconsin, and we at Animal Wellness Action and the Center for Humane Economy with some great partner groups in Wisconsin, when there was a period when the federal courts did not stop the killing of wolves, and Wisconsin opened up a January hunt, and they killed double the number. They allowed dogs to attack wolves, which I consider an animal fighting situation. And I couldn't believe the ruthlessness, but it was all in this atmospheric of hatred toward wolves. And I guess let me pivot to Rolf, if I may. Again, Rolf Peterson, really the dean of wolf scientists in the United States. He's spent so much of his time working at Isle Royale National Park in Michigan. Rolf, obviously, there's a lot of mythology about the wolf, and you studied them up close and personal. I would just love some of your reflections on wolves and why you've been drawn to them, and just a little bit about what you've learned about their emotional lives.
Oh, I think I was drawn to them as a creature of the North way back in the 60s. Farley Mowat's book was probably the first one I read. But as you get into the life of a single wolf, their lives are absolutely amazing. And usually we can't really get into their lives unless they're radio instrumented and we have lots of contact with them. But they're every bit as much of a family animal as we are, and that's come probably best through, now that I think about it, Rick McIntyre in Yellowstone, who's probably watched wolves more than any other human being in history. Has 4 wonderful books. He's not afraid of anthropomorphizing wolf behavior at all, and because it works, it's absolutely true.
Well, you see these family relationships, right? We've learned a lot about elephants, and they have burial ceremonies, or they have memorial sorts of treatments of members of their community, their herds. And it strikes me that you're talking about brothers and sisters and parents and kids and grandparents in a pack. That's a social unit. They are connected. They love each other.
Oh yeah, no question about it. And it's actually, go back to Ernest Thompson Seton's writings about wolves grieving the death of a mate, and it's absolutely true.
And Rolf, I mean,
hard to get a handle on it, I know, for a wolf.
Well, but we have such a common experience with dogs. I've got a dog upstairs, and in my lifetime, I've seen how, my own family, we had our dog outside all the time in Connecticut. I mean, we had him tethered, and we didn't take him in enough, and we got a dog from a puppy mill. We didn't realize it. but I still love the animal. I still made a lot of wrong decisions. But when you begin to see these animals and see their feelings and emotions, I mean, how can you then not translate some of those same feelings to the forebears of all the domesticated animals in our lives?
Yeah, our relationship with dogs is I mean, it's very deep, and everything we see in dogs is in wolves for sure.
Yeah.
Except maybe some of the really strange attachments to humans, but
Right.
strange is
So,
unique perhaps.
Rolf, you've been working as a researcher, I think supported perhaps at times by the National Park Service, but maybe your university or outside funding for that work. But Isle Royale is this very remote national park, right? It's a 6-hour boat ride from Houghton, Michigan, which is in the Keweenaw Peninsula, up into deep into Lake Superior. It's a haul to get there. It takes a long time. And I mean, I went there because I wanted to be in the environment with wolves. I mean, they're a huge draw for the people who go to Isle Royale, aren't they? They're part of the economy.
Absolutely, yeah. Everybody wants to see a wolf. Almost nobody does, but they do experience the same environment. And they have to realize, and I tell lots of people, they're all around us,
Yeah.
but they stay hidden.
Yeah. And this negative narrative by some ranchers, some trophy hunters, and politicians who are serving them is wolves are a threat. They're doing something bad. They're doing something terrible. They're a menace. They actually drive a lot of economic activity. I mean, Yellowstone, Rick's work showed people were streaming in to see these animals. That's rural economic activity, and the wolves don't charge us a thing.
That's right. It's tens of millions of dollars in Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And there's no better place in the world to see wolves. But their effects are so deep. My favorite is the fact that in Wisconsin counties with wolves, literally millions of dollars are saved in car deer accidents. Just the damage to cars results in a huge economic burden, not to mention the human burden of human deaths and medical bills. And that was some very interesting research. And it's not that wolves are reducing deer density, it's that deer, recognizing there's wolves in the environment, avoid linear features like roads, which wolves seem to be attracted to.
Is that right? And so they're not dramatically or not at all reducing deer densities?
Well, the main effect in the Wisconsin study seemed to be an alteration in deer behavior. But I think I'm pretty comfortable understanding that wolves do reduce deer density in some of these northern deep snow areas like Upper Michigan.
Yeah. And what about impacts on forestry and crops? Because you've got wildlife impacts, deer and other animals do have impacts there.
Yeah, I mean, the effect of wolves would be all positive. Foresters have trouble growing trees in Upper Michigan because too many deer feed on those trees, and same with agricultural crops too.
And I remember when you testified, I'm not sure if it was in Lansing, the capital of Michigan, or in some other setting, when there was discussion about a ballot measure and about whether wolves would be subjected to trophy hunting and commercial trapping. And you talked about wolves and their effect in reducing the incidence of chronic wasting disease, which is a brain wasting disease. It has different forms: mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, and it's chronic wasting disease in cervix, moose, deer, and elk. Tell us a little bit about that and what the effect of CWD is on hunting and potentially human health.
Yeah, it's a very strange. It's not an organism, but it's a prion, a folded protein. Can't be sterilized out of the environment, and its effects on these cervids is a chronic problem, and it's one that wolves would easily pick up on. So wolves are so sensitive to the condition of prey that they are likely to cull an animal with CWD out of the population for years before it would otherwise die. So it's a hypothesis, but it's one that so far has seen some support in that wolves and CWD don't overlap measurably. Now it's getting very close in Wisconsin, but CWD has not yet moved into upper Michigan except on the Wisconsin border. And I think it's reasonable to hypothesize that wolves will provide that firewall against CWD moving.
Just explain CWD a little bit more. So it's a brain wasting disease. It's shortened lifespan.
And deer get sick. I mean, they're chronically ill, and but it lasts for years, and perhaps several years. And wolves could detect that in a very early stage, I'm sure.
Yes,
they're so sensitive too.
Well, I was struck by some of the charts that you showed in Wisconsin, the border state to you in Michigan. And the chart basically had, in deep red areas where there was a highest incidence among deer of chronic wasting disease. And the beet red areas of Wisconsin were the areas with no wolves. And then it was a completely different color where wolves were. And, when we think of hunting, hunting is a much bigger enterprise for cervids than it is for wolves or other,
sure.
apex predators. And, people really don't eat dogs, just like they don't eat cats, but people do eat deer and elk and moose. And isn't there a rather obvious argument that the wolf's behavior is beneficial for hunters by cleansing the population of CWD infected deer in Wisconsin?
That's a pretty logical argument. I'm not sure hunters are as logical in their behavior as we might think they are. I think they've just become fatalistic, and if we carefully clean that deer, it'll be fine. But in truth, CWD is throughout the entire deer, muscle, blood, tissues. So, it's a huge experiment, human experiment that we're running to see, will it ever break through into humans in any meaningful way?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Well, Rolf, you come from, in terms of your residency in the UP for a long time, you come from a state that's got big agriculture, big hunting. Are wolves just going to be a menace over time, more and more and more, or do they limit their own numbers? What's the risk of letting them be?
In Michigan, they're doing fine in the Upper Peninsula. They're found throughout 30,000 square kilometers, 600 to 700 wolves. Hasn't changed much in 10 years. I don't see any problem in letting them be. I am surprised that wolves haven't gotten into Lower Michigan, which is an entirely different situation, but there's probably habitat there in northern Lower Michigan for a couple hundred wolves. And then of course, you're going to have the same kind of conflicts as you have in Wisconsin, with a close interface between people and domestic animals and wolves. But in Upper Michigan, it's lightly populated. Agriculture is nothing like it used to be decades ago, and I think they've melted into the landscape just fine.
Are people
it's playing off of something Susan said. The only time I see overt hatred in the UP is when a hunting season is proposed and a trapping season is proposed, and it seems everybody comes out of the woodwork with an opinion about wolves, and it does lead to overt hatred. Absolutely.
But if there's not a proposal, then people just say, okay, this is fine. We're actually okay with the wolves.
It doesn't seem to surface in letters to the editor, conversations in the grocery store. You don't hear much about wolves. They're still being killed illegally, sure. And primarily during the firearm deer season, which is a very big deal in the UP. But wolves in the UP are also very, very savvy about human behavior, and they know when they're at risk and when they're not. And come November 15th, they're just very careful.
Well, this is not so much a science question, Rolf, but more to someone who has so much rich and deep experience. I mean, what's your take on Wyoming's policy to have a predator zone where basically you can kill wolves every day of the year in unlimited numbers by any method, including with a snowmobile? What is that? How do you process that sort of policy?
I'm afraid one thing wolves do is they provide a mirror for ourselves, and it could be good, it could be bad. And I think the Wyoming regulations about wolves are an example of the bad. And I mean, this case in Wyoming is case in point.
Yeah.
It's the most extreme state regulation about wolves that I'm aware of. Even in Alaska, where airplanes have been used for hunting wolves legally and illegally for a long, long time. There's no stated goal of getting rid of wolves in any significant part of the state.
Given how capable wolves are as hunters, given their size and their physical prowess, I mean, to me, I'm always amazed that there are basically no human incidents where wolves are hurting people. They really stay away from us.
Yeah, and it's a big mystery, I think. Every other large carnivore in the world at some point kills people, and wolves just don't seem to be doing that very much in North America. 2 cases that I'm aware of. Now, Europe was very different, perhaps because of rabies, perhaps because children were used as shepherds. But the wolf is a very safe, large carnivore, and I think my own idea is that it has something to do with the long, long association between wolves and people, which gave us the dog.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of little memory chip in their brain that we're a little bit different. We're just not another big hunk of meat to a wolf.
Do they know also to stay away from sheep and cattle? What's your instinct of their understanding about that?
Well, I think they have to be taught. They have to be taught to avoid dangerous situations of all types. And sheep may represent a dangerous situation to some wolves, and that especially if they've been brought up in a pack with elders that have survived and learned the rules of living with people. They can transmit those rules very easily to the next generation. So
yeah,
and preserving that ability for wolves to educate other wolves is important.
And I think, when we have this hyper exploitation, we kill a lot of those elders, don't we? So we lose the teachers in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then everybody's just inventing life as best they can, and they may not realize what these boundaries should be like to reduce conflict. I mean, wolves are not looking for conflict, and they would like to reduce it just as many people would.
Yeah. I asked through one of my colleagues, we called Governor Mark Gordon's office this week and asked him to address us at this webinar. He condemned Cody Roberts' actions, but thus far has not offered any prescriptive response to whether Wyoming's policy should change. I mean, there are 2 questions. One is not a matter of policy, it's law. Is Cody Roberts going to be charged under the state anti-cruelty statute? Our legal team has done a legal analysis saying that the statute allows for that because of the things that he did to the wolf, especially after taking the wolf into his possession. Then there's this broader issue of how does Wyoming treat wolves? So I'm eagerly awaiting a word from the governor. I did go to one of the U.S. senator's offices yesterday and asked if that senator would support legislation to stop the intentional use of snowmobiles and other motorized vehicles to kill wolves and other wildlife. I mean, last time I checked, a snowmobile is not supposed to be a weapon. And we have statements from snowmobile associations about being sensitive to wildlife and slowing down and not even unintentionally hitting them, no mind intentionally. So I'm hoping that one outcome of this this terrible circumstance for the young adolescent female wolf, whom we've named Theia, or we've adopted the name of the Greek goddess of light to try to shed light on this dark situation in Wyoming, is that we get that national policy. I think we're now going to be re-examining. The United States is going to be forced to defend its position in court over the decision not to relist wolves because of the absence of meaningful protective policies in Wyoming. There has to be a state safety net. And if you can allow a guy and other people to chase down these animals with snowmobiles and crush them, that is a problem. It screams out that the state is not responsible. It was almost a laughable moment when Wyoming Game and Fish said that they have the gold standard of wildlife management. When you have a policy like that. I mean, there are a number of other policies in Wyoming that I think also just don't pass the smell test, but this one is, people are baffled. 99% of people are baffled. How could you not prohibit the use of snowmobiles to kill animals?
Well, the Airborne Hunting Act is a pretty good example of a federal piece of legislation that followed outrage at wolves being killed from aircraft in Alaska.
Exactly. 1971, the Federal Airborne Hunting Act, which has its own set of loopholes, but I think is a model for stopping the use of ground-based motorized vehicles to run down animals. So we've got ample precedent there.
Wayne,
Joseph,
I'm sorry to cut in.
Yeah.
We're getting ready for Q&A time. If you're about ready to move on to that.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to mention one last thing briefly, and that is to thank so many of our supporters for pitching in, contacting Secretary Deb Haaland about this problem, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of the Interior's failure to assure that when they transferred management authority over to wolves, that they weren't just handing it over to a state that was going to do terrible things. And I'm sorry to say that the policies just don't pass muster with any reasonable standard of proper treatment. And I will mention, Joseph, and again, I'm sorry to cut into the question time, but it's very important. Next week, Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado and Representative Tom Tiffany are going to be presenting a bill on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. I'm astonished that they're doing this at this time, but we're going to have a vote next week on a bill to remove federal protections for wolves in the other 20 or so states that they inhabit in the lower 48. So what happened with Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana is that federal protections were removed because of a congressional rider a number of years ago. And this is what we've got: year-round hunting, limitless hunting, anything goes. And now two lawmakers, after seeing what happened here, are saying, okay, let's do this nationwide. So we are going to be calling people to act, to contact your U.S. representatives next week to oppose this Boebert-Tiffany wolf, killing bill. They call it the Trust the Science Act, which is Orwellian. Because there's nothing scientific about running down animals with snowmobiles or attacking them with packs of dogs. So, Joseph, and I want to just thank a number of people. John Barr was a very, very generous donor to allow us to put a reward out for information that would lead to the arrest and incarceration for at least 1 year of Cody Roberts. We'll pay a reward to people. So we're getting tips. We welcome more tips coming in. We're going to work hard to promote prosecution, and obviously we're going to work more broadly on policy. But we've got some defensive actions that we've got to take next week in the U.S. House, and we've got to get on the offense in Wyoming and a number of other states to stop these absolutely draconian policies.
All right, very good. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, panelists. I appreciate it. I was grateful that I took typing in high school, so fervent was my having to answer a lot of the questions as they came through. Thank you, audience. You've really provided great feedback, great questions. Not all, I'm afraid, we'll be able to address in our short 15 minutes, but I'm grateful and I've seen them, and I will take your other unanswered questions back home so that we can discuss them and address them in another format. So thank you for that. I'll try and direct these questions to individual panelists, and I would ask so that we can get to as many of them as we can, that we answer pretty directly. So Wayne, the first one is for you. What is an update of where you believe right now the status is of attempts to have Cody Roberts charged?
Well, the Sublette County District Attorney issued a statement this week, saying that there are complications, there are challenges, there are questions about the statute, the worthiness of the statute, but he has said that he does, I think, concur with our legal assessment from our legal team that statute can be exercised. They're conducting an investigation. Those investigations often do take time. I would say that if you don't have a case here, then you're not going to have a case at any point. So I'm hopeful that the Sublette County Sheriff and the District Attorney are going to take action. I do believe a case has been opened by the federal government looking at Lacey Act violations, which has to do with taking possession of wildlife illegally, and then also potentially the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, which was a 2019 national anti-cruelty statute that has a number of exemptions, but I'm just not so sure that this exemption of using a snowmobile to crush an animal applies. So we're working on it. We're paying attention. I can't quite forecast, but I'm hopeful.
All right, very good. A number of our viewers want to know how to take action right away. Ryan has a slide. We've created a special URL. If you follow it, you will be able to send a letter. It's automatically generated. You fill in your name and information. It goes to the Secretary of the Interior, and it calls on her and her agency to relist wolves in Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. So this is one thing you can do super easily. You can do it tonight. The more we cram her inbox with requests of American citizens to protect these wolves, the more likely our voice is to be heard. Thank you, Ryan, for bringing that up. Wayne, is there anything you would like to add about that effort to have wolves relisted?
I'm disappointed in the Biden administration's Department of the Interior. It rejected two very credible, well-argued petitions. We were among a group of 80 organizations that petitioned more than a year ago. We all predicted that something like this was going to happen, that you create a climate of hate toward wolves. People do terrible things, kill them in numbers that are just reckless, and they're just timid. They're timid on wildlife protection issues. And I will say that, I'm just amazed. I think the public is completely with us. I think even you saw in Wyoming at the hearing, there were dozens and dozens of people who testified. They were all on our side on the issue. And this administration should be protecting these remarkable animals. And they're failing to do so. And we will do our best to make our case in court. But I hope that Secretary Haaland, especially with her Native American ancestry, she thinks about the wolf and the place that it has in Native American creation stories. I know I work with tribes in Michigan, and they were at the forefront of protecting wolves, and Rolf Peterson worked with many of those people as well. So I've been very disappointed. The Fish and Wildlife Service has just done a number of things that make my head spin.
All right. Rolf, is it a hopeless case to get ranchers and others on the side of this issue? Maybe it's even a fatuous question. Can we convert the adversary in any way towards compassion?
Oh, I wouldn't expect that ranchers would condone cruelty of this sort. I mean, their lives revolve around animals, and I can't imagine farmers and ranchers would condone this sort of cruelty. Having said that, it's once you've got a dyed in the wool attitude, turning that around is not easy. And toward compassion, it's not a hopeless case, but it's maybe an uphill battle. But I wouldn't paint ranchers and farmers with the same brush at all.
Mhm. Wayne, you care to expand on that?
Well, I think Rolf makes a good point, right? I mean, these are people who make their livelihoods off of animals. And, rural people often know animals very well. I guess we just reach this point sometimes when you can become dull or coarse or insensitive to animals' needs. And, the notion of the good shepherd, the notion of the steward, animal husbandry, these are notions that are built into, they're foundational. I wrote about these things in one of my books called The Bond. This notion of caretaking and custodianship should be part of the relationship when people are using animals. This should be condemned. These are the first folks, the farmers and the ranchers, who should condemn this. But we see this antipathy toward wolves from some of the folks, and I think the wolves in some ways are a proxy for some of the larger frustrations that some in the ranching community face, and they take their vengeance out on wolves. And when we work with farmers and ranchers who embody these attitudes of proper care of animals and respect for other wildlife, that's what we strive for. Those are the people whose voices we want to amplify.
Very good. Thank you, sir. Susan, can you recommend any books or other resources where people who are impacted by this can maybe become not more resilient, but at least better able to withstand some of the emotional challenges presented by combating animal cruelty?
I'm thinking about books. I think that there are strategies that people can do. And the first one probably is connecting with other people who are like-minded people, joining groups, Sierra Club, different groups that have volunteer chapters in the communities. I think that that's a really helpful place, because then what you find is your people. You find people that are like-minded, that think like you, and they have actions they can do. So any group that has local group, grassroots group that has local chapters, I think is good. I think the other thing is that is the reason this speaks to people is because they sense that they have that animals have a consciousness, that they resonate with that. And so I think that there's some websites people can go to. Heart Math Institute is one that looks at the consciousness of human beings. And I think that developing a really strong meditation program, a mindfulness program that allows me to think broader than just my own position here is really important. So you can go to some of Dawson Church's stuff is really good. He wrote Bliss Brain, books like that also, talk about our connection to things. And so I'm trying to think of a specific book that focuses specifically on our connection to animals in terms of advocacy. And I'm coming up short with one, so I'll have to think about that.
I bet Wayne could certainly recommend one.
Yeah, I bet he could do that.
Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, probably wrote one or two of those. So I think that having for me, with the clients that I work with who are highly sensitive, intuitive, wonderful people, I think that them developing a mindfulness program where they're centering themselves, they're exercising, they're meditating, they're connecting with other people, they're outside. If you want to see something that's perfect, you spend time in nature, and being outside connects us. And I want to say one last thing. There was some research recently that just came out about consciousness of species. And this is really lovely research. About 40 scientists signed on to it. It just came out this last week. But it's the concept that they're even finding that bees play, they roll down pieces of wood. They're finding that fruit flies dream. And the sense of sentience among all species is really growing. And that tells us that we are moving in a more positive direction, because we're looking now at our own interconnectedness with other species. And that awareness is, I think, what's really changing things.
Susan, if you can send me a couple of titles by tomorrow morning, I'll share them when we forward the link of this webinar to registrants. I'm sure they would appreciate it. I would love to read that book you just described. Wayne, I'll let you respond to any books you might recommend, and then ask you as a final question, talk about the role of the BLM, not only as it relates to wolves as it may, but also the mindset that we seem so pervasive in our treatment of wild animals, be they horses, wolves, coyotes, and more.
Well, let me just say, one of the books I wrote called The Bond, I argued that we humans have an instinctive compassion for other creatures. I mean, we lived in a world as hunters and gatherers for most of human history where we were in the mix with other animals. And you can see all sorts of pro-social behaviors. I mean, our pet keeping and our love of nature and wild animals. Animals enrich us, they excite us, they literally animate our world. Yet we have this other side of dominance and exploitation, from factory farming to commercial trapping to trophy hunting to horse slaughter to animal fighting. So this is the tug of war that we're in our society. And I do think that, as Susan said, science is leading us in a very clear direction. And I'm always amazed when people say, trust the science. Well, what about the science of animal welfare? What about the science of sentience? What about the science of animal cognition? What about the science of pro-family behavior? These animals all matter. And this is one wolf that has stirred the conscience of tens and tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world. We lose this opportunity to turn tragedy into some sort of triumph if we don't work very hard to change Wyoming policy, to change national policy, to defeat this Boebert-Tiffany amendment on the floor. What a signal that would send. They're bringing up a vote to remove federal protections for wolves across the vast expanse that they inhabit, just as this controversy has erupted. If we can't win now, then that says something about us. We've got to turn our anger into action. And, I'm so glad that those that you are participating, you're now part of Animal Wellness Action, the Center for Humane Economy. When we are working together, we can drive incredible change. I've seen it happen. I've seen how transformational change is happening in so many different sectors of animal use. And this is an incredible moment now. So let's not just despair. Let's organize and activate and do it in an intentional, strategic way. And we want to help you do that. So please keep in touch with us every step of the way.
All right, very good. And Wayne, we'll have to curtail our conversation from addressing the BLM. Stay tuned, watch our communications. We'll be going after this Boebert Amendment. We are filing suit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have all kinds of things going on, not only with wolves, but many other animals that need your support, your vigilance, our cooperation. So I want to say thank you to the many, many people who have helped make this event possible and make it a success. Again, your comments, your questions have been overwhelmingly powerful, impassioned. Now's the time to turn that passion into action, and we'll help guide you along the way for that. Dr. Kane Ronning, Dr. Peterson, Wayne, thank you very much. A great conversation. I really appreciate it. Ryan behind the scenes, grateful for your masterfully handling that end of it. And with this, we'll wrap up this event of our Claudia Miller Ignite series on animal welfare, and we'll be in touch soon about our next topic. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.